Today we're going to go over some of the plumbing configurations and the pump configuration that you'll use on the TFTN, including pump wiring. We're going to look at the different diagrams. These are all from the installation manual, and these show common system layouts that you might use, and what I'm going to do is just describe the operation to you and the settings that you might need to change. In this first application, we have a boiler with an indirect fired water heater. Our CH pump, if you look, is wired back to the auxiliary pump connection. The system pump is tied in parallel with the central heating pump, meaning that these two are going to run both at the same time. And our domestic pump is wired back to the DHW connection. In this application, when the CH pump runs, it's going to push water through the return pipe up into the boiler, out of the boiler, through the low loss header or closely spaced tees, and then recirculate that water over and over. When we have an indirect hot water call, this pump, the CH pump, will turn off. The check valve will end up closing as the domestic hot water pump turns on. This domestic pump is both going to push water through the indirect and pull water through the boiler, acting as both a primary loop circulator and an indirect circulator in one pump. In an application like this, the system pump typically would shut down during the domestic call, and when you go into your pump settings, menu 24.4.6, you can set the operation of the auxiliary pump 1 system pump, and you can change that to be either always on, meaning that it will run as long as there's demand for anything, or you can set it to only run for CH. Here's another zone valve application. And in this application, we're assuming that the zone valves are wired from zone input to R, meaning that the boiler is supplying 24 volts to these valves. I forgot to mention that on the last slide. Our system pump wires back to auxiliary 2, the same as it did. Domestic pump still wires to domestic, same as it was. And in this application, the boiler pump is what we're using for the primary loop. And the reason that's been done is this pump is the only one that is capable of pushing water through the boiler and past the closely spaced tees or through the low loss header. And in this application, what we need to have happen is when there's a heating or hot water call, this pump must run, and that's what the boiler pump output will do. The domestic output only runs when there's a domestic hot water call. And again, the system pump can be configured to either run for any demand or only run for central heating demands. Here we have another application, and you might choose this, for example, if you have a smaller indirect tank and a larger boiler and you don't want to size a circulator that is required to pump through the boiler. You can save some money on the circulator by doing these closely spaced tees. When that's done, however, you need to make sure that there's always water flowing through the boiler and past those tees for the indirect to satisfy. And you'll also want to make sure that the system pump shuts down. So this is the wiring you would choose, with your system pump being wired back to aux 2. Boiler pump wires to the boiler pump contact, which again runs for any demand, and your domestic pump, which runs only for domestic demands. The domestic pump will recirculate past the closely spaced tees, and it's the boiler pump's job to push water past those tees for the indirect to draw water off of. In a zone circulator application, it's much the same thing. There are a couple of differences. One is your zone input, so this yellow connection and the 120 volt will be jumpered together. And what that means is that zones 1, 2, and 3 will be powered with 120 volts. So each of these pumps down here, zone 1, 2, and 3, will get 120 volts. In this application, again, the boiler pump is the only one responsible for pushing water through the boiler, so it wires back to boiler pump. Our domestic pump wires back to DHW as normal. And in an application like this, when domestic is active, the zone pump outputs will turn off. Here's another option that you might use, and this is showing both an upstream and an optional downstream tank. And for those that aren't sure, upstream tank means it's a tank that is on the boiler side. So if you look at the buffer tank, or if this was a low loss header, if the tank is on the boiler side of the loop, it's an upstream tank. If your tank is basically a zone off of the system, or it's downstream of your closely spaced tees or your buffer tank, then it's a downstream tank. Each one has its advantages, and different applications will determine which one you use. In the first case, where we have an upstream tank, again, as always, our domestic pump wires back to the domestic hot water contact. The buffer tank option or pump has been used in this case. And what that means is we're going to wire this pump up to the auxiliary 2 contact in this instance. And what that means is you're going to go into aux2 settings. You're going to set the pump to a buffer tank pump. When the temperature of the buffer tank is less than the set point that you've chosen in your boiler controller, this pump is going to run. If you're using the optional downstream tank, there really is no change in the wiring. This pump will still wire back to the DHW connection, and in this instance your 3 zone circulators are going to wire back to zones 1, 2, and 3. Another thing shown on this diagram, and this isn't shown on the previous ones, is if you want to use domestic hot water recirculation, you can do that. You'll need to both install an auxiliary sensor, which would wire back to your aux NTC connection, and you'd have to supply a bronze or stainless pump for your domestic hot water recirc, and then this pump would wire back to the aux1 in this case. And the way the domestic recirc circulator works is when that sensor gets below a certain temperature, this pump will kick on. This is a different configuration using a buffer tank with zone valves. So again, in this case, we have the zone input jumper to 24 volts to power our 3 zone valves. Our system side or downstream circulator is going to wire back to aux2. We have a downstream tank or an upstream tank, and you can do either or. Again, the domestic circulators wire back to domestic. Your recirc wires back to the recirc connection, whether it's upstream or downstream. And we still have a buffer tank pump, which is basically going to run whenever there is a call for the buffer tank. And in this application, the domestic pump, when it turns on, if you're doing an upstream tank, will pull the check valve here closed. That's going to force water through the tank, through the boiler, and back through the tank again. Thanks for attending NTI Online today. Hopefully this gives you some more insight on how to use the pump connections and the wiring diagrams in the installation manual.
Thanks for watching the video today. If you'd like to check out more videos, see the link below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for all the future updates. And also check us out on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram.